Hey guys, what is going on? In this one, we're going to be covering the basic tonal controls here in the Develop panel. This video might be a little bit longer than the other ones because I'm going to be covering all of the sliders here. It's hard to really talk about them individually in separate videos. That doesn't really make much sense because they kind of go together. So I'm going to briefly just walk through them real quick and then just go through a few example images of how I might use them. And I'll just preface this again with what I said before in another video, where a lot of this stuff it's art that we're dealing with here, right? So what I like isn't going to be what you like and vice versa. So this is just how I use these sliders and how I get a certain look for photos. And I'm just kind of try to show you guys some just standard examples of how they work. But feel free to, go all out, go crazy with these, whatever you like to do. That's what we're all about here. So, all right, let's get started. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the auto button here. If you're one of those people that doesn't really want to jump in here and mess with all these sliders and you just want to have Lightroom take its best stab at figuring out what the best tonal controls or tonal settings are for your photo, you can just click this auto button and you can see all of these sliders get adjusted automatically. Lightroom takes its best guess and says, I think this is the best settings for this particular photo. And it's not always what I like, but you can see that it did take its best guess and it doesn't look too bad. Something else you can do here after you make edits to do an easy before and after, if you just hit the backslash key, I think it's either backslash or forward slash, but it's the slash just above the return key on your keyboard and just below the backspace key. So if you press that, you'll see in the top right, you can see the little before thing that shows up here, and you can just press it again to go back and forth. So you can see here's the before and here's the after of what that auto button does. But we're going to press reset because we want to do this ourselves. So again, if you remember back from the video I did on the histogram, all of these areas up here of the histogram correspond to these sliders here. So exposure is your main sort of bread and butter that controls the mid section of that histogram, the main tones of your photo. It has generally the most impact as you move it around. The highlights control the section that's sort of further to the right over here, not all the way to the right, but right here. So these are the lighter tones in your photo. The shadows control the tones that are a little bit darker, but not all the way to the left. That's right here. And then the whites and the blacks are the extreme ends of either spectrum. So that's kind of what the sliders are. And again, if you remember, if you double click on any of these, it just returns them to the default position. So what I think I'm going to do now is just walk through a handful of photos here and just sort of walk through how I might adjust a photo with these sliders. So here's our first picture. This is from a trip to Italy, Sorrento, Italy, right on the Amalfi Coast. Amazing vacation spot. Highly recommend it. Probably not a place you want to visit right now with the global pandemic, but if you have a chance to get over there, it is an amazing city. So exposure, I think with this one I might, I think what I'm going to do here for all of these edits is just use Adobe Standard, because I think that's what, I can at least count on everyone watching this video to have this one in their profile. You might not have some of the camera specific ones that I do, so I'm just going to go with Adobe Standard. It's a good starting point. I like it. Adobe Neutral is a good one as well, but for I think these edits, I'm just going to go with Standard. There's a little bit more color in them, and it's just a good standard starting point. So exposure. I might raise this one up just a little bit, but for the most part, I think this photo is exposed pretty well. The contrast slider, what this one does is it, like it says, it adds contrast to the photo. You can see if I move it up here, it increases the contrast. I never really use this. I use it if I'm making a black and white, because I like contrasty, punchy black and white photos, but I like to give my photos contrast through other means, and I just generally try to avoid using this slider for the most part. So I'm going to skip over it in a lot of what I'm doing here. Highlights. Let's see, for this one, I think I might bring the highlights down a little bit in this one. You can see what it's doing to the clouds up in this area. It's bringing back a little bit more definition and a little bit more detail there. And I think in this scenario, I would bring the highlights down a little bit. Shadows, for the most part, what this is going to do is it's going to bring out some of the detail in these darker spots of the photo. So if you'll notice down here in the town and the trees, they start to bring the shadows up. It's going to bring more detail back into those dark sections. You can see how that slider works. I'm generally bringing this slider up a lot of the time. I like to bring back some of the detail in there just to bring a little bit more dynamic range into my photo. And then the whites, similar to the highlights, I'm going to bring those down just a little bit to just darken some of the lighter tones here up in the clouds, but don't really need to move it that much. And then if I've brought the shadows up, I almost always bring the blacks down a little bit to bring back a little bit more contrast into the photo. And you can kind of see how this slider works. I'm bringing more of that deeper black into the photo. And here's another cool trick. If you're working with the blacks slider or the white slider, if you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, you can see as I adjust the black slider, you can see it shows you the areas that are completely black. So it's just kind of an interesting way to see if there is really no detail there at all, and if you have just a completely black spot of the photo. So that's a cool way to use that slider. So this is my stab at this photo using these sliders. And again, let's take a look at the before and after. So you can kind of see how much you can really change a photo just by using these basic tonal sliders. So that's that one. Let's move on to the next one here. Here's another picture of a town close to me here. In this case, I might bring the exposure down a little bit, bring back some of the detail in the clouds in the sky. You can see here it's a little bit blown out, but I like bringing the exposure down a little bit here. And then same deal with the highlights. I want to bring back some more detail in the sky here and in that brighter section. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit. This was taken at sunset, so you wouldn't quite know it from looking at the original photo. Shadows, I might bring these up just a hair, not much. Same thing with the whites, I'll bring those down a little bit, like the highlights. And the blacks, I might bring in just a little bit. You can kind of see what it's doing here below this little shack. If I keep bringing it down, the whole area goes completely black, and I don't quite want that. I still want to see some of the detail underneath here, so I'll probably bring this down just a little bit. Let's see, maybe I can bring the highlight one down even further. I'll bring back as much detail into the sky as I can. So here's the before, after. Big difference to the photo there. See, we haven't even gotten into the colors or the clarity and the vibrance and the saturation. We haven't even gotten into all of that stuff, and you can see what a big difference just these handful of sliders can have on a photo. Take a look at another example here. In this one, I think I would bring the exposure up a little bit. You can see here from looking at the histogram, a lot of the tones are shifted over here into the left side. So that's a good indication that you might want to bump things up this way just a little bit. And another thing about RAW files is, since the camera isn't processing them, they're going to look kind of flat when you first bring them in. So you kind of have to edit them. If you're shooting RAW, you just can't immediately export it and send the file out. It's going to look flat. It might not look as good as it would if you had just left it as a JPEG and let the camera process it. So because you're shooting RAW, you have to make some edits here with the photo. So in this case, the photo was a little bit flat, a little darker. I'm going to bring the exposure up a bit. Let's see, I might bring the highlights down just a hair. That doesn't really do too much here. Shadows, I don't think I want to change too much in the way of shadows or whites for that matter. Blacks, I might bring those down just a little bit to bring back a little bit more contrast into the photo. And you can see just with these simple edits here how much of an impact on the picture this had. So if you can imagine getting a JPEG out of your camera that looked, a little bit underexposed, maybe a little bit flatter than you would have liked, you'd be stuck for the most part with that. You could make some edits here and it might work out, but you just have so much more control if you're shooting raw. So that is that one. Here's our last example. This was taken up in Acadia National Park. I forget the name of this lighthouse, but it was kind of rainy that morning. Just not a good sky to see up here. So it was kind of crappy conditions. This might be a good example where I might turn this one into a black and white photo. And in Lightroom, that's very easy. You just press the black and white button up here next to color, and you can see it turns into the black and white. And in this case, since I'm working with black and white, I might actually use the contrast slider here to just bring this up a little bit, bring back some of the contrast in the picture to give me that contrasty black and white photo. That's kind of what I like out of my black and whites. I don't know if I would really do anything here except maybe bring the shadows up a little bit and then the blacks down. A little bit more range in there. Maybe the whites, highlights bring down a bit. You can always just play with these sliders too, go back and forth and kind of see what they do. And I tend to do that a lot too, and just get it to a point that I like, and there you go. So that's another example. So that's the tonal sliders. You can see that these are the main bread and butter of editing a photo in Lightroom, and you can see just what a dramatic impact they have on the photo. In this case, it was a little bit overblown. You can really bring a lot more detail back into the picture. Once we get into the presence section down here with texture, clarity, vibrance, saturation, that's where some really fun creative stuff can happen. So we're going to take a look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons if you found this content meaningful. As always, leave comments. I'd be happy to answer them in a future video, or I might just respond to you if there's just one or two. So thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next one. Cheers.